It is Wednesday, my dudes, which means it is time for another First Thoughts and Initial Impressions Epic 7 video. This one will be on Dragon King Sharun, the ML5 we've known about for a couple of weeks now, but was now finally just shown earlier this morning over on YouTube. You already know the drill. I'm going to give you my 2 cents on the characters, what I think about them, where I'd play them, what kinds of gear and artifacts I'd play them on, all those things you've come to expect from me in a First Thoughts and Initial Impressions video. So, without further ado, let's take a look at Dragon King Sharun's S3 animation.
From life into death, and death into life anew. Your eyes are clouded by greed. Let me wash it all away. You're the new offerings.
I don't know, I'm not really feeling that S3 animation. I feel like we should see more of Sharun than just a close-up of her face, and the dragon doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot for me. Before moving on to the stats, in the English dub of Epic 7, all versions of Sharun are voiced by the wonderful Xanthe Huynh. You can hear her as Haru in Persona 5, as well as its various different spin-offs, as well as Pela if you play Honkai Star Rail. Moving on to the stats, Dragon King Sharun is a light soul weaver of the Virgo zodiac symbol. She shares a stat line with Maid Chloe as well as her RGB counterpart, Sharun. Taking a look at her stats, she has 640 attack, 720 defense, 5,340 health, 106 speed, 15% critical hit chance, 150% critical hit damage, 18% starting effectiveness, and no starting effect resistance. Imprint release for the back and front lines is attack percentage, and imprint concentration is effectiveness for herself. So yeah, you're probably going to want to have duplicates because effectiveness is one of the better imprint concentrations in the game. Overall, very high defense. Health is low, but okay for a Soul Weaver. Speed is slightly below average. Attack doesn't really matter. The other main thing to care about in the stat line here is, of course, the effectiveness because, well, she's a debuffer. And you're going to find that out when we talk about the kit right now. Skill 2 is a passive, Lullaby for Waves. This is probably the main reason most people are going to be rolling for the character. It states, at the start of the turn, dispels all debuffs which prevent movement, remember, those are sleeps and stuns, from all allies. At the start of someone's turn, when an ally is inflicted with a debuff which prevents movement, increases the combat readiness of Sharun by 20 to 30%, depending on Malagora, and grants Cascade to all allies, can only be activated once per turn. Cascade is an undispellable buff that states, after attacking, deals 2,500 fixed damage to the target, dispelled after attacking. Skill 3 is It Going to Rain? You acquire 3 souls upon use, and it has a 4 to 5 turn cooldown, depending on Malagora. It is an AoE attack that decreases buff durations by 2 turns, before a 80 to 100% chance to inflict class debuff for 2 turns, and decrease combat readiness of all enemies by 20%, increases the combat readiness of Sharun by 50%. Class debuff states that if the target is a thief, warrior, ranger, or mage, they receive decreased attack. If they're a knight or soul weaver, instead it is decreased defense. Lastly, we have Sharun's basic skill, the hilariously named turtle flipping. Attacks the enemy with a 30 to 40% chance to stun the target for 1 turn. After attacking when the target is stunned, increases combat readiness of the ally with the highest attack, except for the caster, by 20%. Soulburn effect for the cost of 10 souls increases the effect chance of the stun to 100%. Okay, now we know the kit. Let's break it down, and we're going to start with turtle flipping. So, here's the thing. It's a 40% stun. That's the best debuff pretty much in the game. It's on rate. It has built-in CR push for another character. That's really good. Means that the character has great synergy with like the counter set on like Sacred Tree Branch, for example. That is definitely a build that has a lot of value in it if you high roll. I have nothing really to complain about with turtle flipping as a skill. It is bog standard, just generic support good stuff. My gripe is that it's kind of boring, right? I feel like every support S1 now stuns, silences, CR pushes back, or pushes an ally forward. That feels like we've been in that same holding pattern for like a year. And the thing is, if they change it to something where it was like, I don't know, attack down or a 1 turn slow or something, I would sit here and say, oh, well, it's not as good as just turtle flipping being a stun, right? Or it's not as good as like AOL being a silence, right? And that's the problem. Like, We've gotten to the point where basic skills are very boring, but if they're not boring, then we're going to complain that they're not boring. You see, like, the problem? Like, I need basic skills to feel impactful, but also not the same thing I've seen like 20 times. It's a really hard problem to solve. Hopefully, maybe the design team takes note of this and does something about it. I don't envy those designers that are in that position. It's a problem that they probably aren't even interested in solving, but it's something I'd like to see. Moving on, we're going to go back and visit the S3. I'll talk about the S2 at the end. Bear with me. We'll get there. You'll understand why in due time. So, this move is actually really, really good, right? It is a buff duration decrease for 2 turns, and then obviously the pushback. That is already very good. If you have a character that is like an opener or a setup, and it undoes all of your opponent's setup and then pushes them back so that you get the tempo, that is already, it's generic, but it's very, very good. And the 50% CR push that Sharun gets, we'll get to that in due time when we talk again about the S2, about why that is a relevant portion of the skill. I also really love the class debuff component of this. I think it's a really cool throwback to Troublemaker Crozet, because class buff, which is what Crozet had, really cool skill, and I wish they had utilized it more. Basically, Thieves, Warriors, Rangers, Mages, it was difficult when they had the class buff for you to deal damage to them. Those same classes under the effective class debuff have a significantly harder time dealing damage. And then Knights and Soul Weavers were harder to kill under the effect of class buff. Under class debuff, those same classes are significantly easier to kill. I think that's a really cool way to bring back something that is one of the better mechanics that we've had over the years. That said, as a turn 2 player, most of the time, not always, I have aggro down. If you watch my previous Emperor account review, I was absolutely being an aggro player at the end of the season. Seeing another strip set up into defense break on at least my tanks and maybe my Soul Weavers, depending on the effectiveness, that's really annoying, because need I remind you, this past season that we just came out of, the Insight season, it was cleavers that were basically the Hall of Fame players, right? The Hall of Fame players were dominated by people with very aggressive, explosive setups. So having another character that can just, invalidate your mitigation when we already have like Galastraze Architect, right? It's not really a good feeling. So I don't know how I feel about this. It kind of can potentially be used nefariously by more aggressive players, with the defense break, things like that. And I know what you all are saying, but wait, Dragon King Sharun only has 106 base speed. Nobody would actually think to use that character for something very aggressive, would they? Well, yes, and we'll talk about that now with the S2. So here's Lullaby for waves again. And as I said earlier, this is probably going to be the reason why people pull for this character, right? Dispels all debuffs which prevent movement, so it stops your opponent from stunning your team. It stops your opponent from sleeping your team. That is primarily what the passive is for. It's what most people are probably going to pull for, right? So if you'll afford me the opportunity to let me cook, I present to you the Dragon King Sharun Iceberg, right? So, Layer 1 is that this character was designed to punish Death Dealer Ray. It's pretty obvious, right? This character has sleeps on the S3, has sleeps on the S1, is one of the strongest characters pretty much in the game. There wasn't anything in the January 18th balance adjustment preview that would suggest that there's a character that counters Death Dealer Ray. Why buff a character when our newest Moonlight 5-star that you can purchase or roll for has the answer to Death Dealer Ray, right? This is the surface level answer for what this character is supposed to do. She helps you versus characters that sleep and stun. Ergo, Sharun is a counter pick to deter you from playing characters that try to sleep my whole team on turn 1. Now, Layer 2. You might be thinking, well, hold on. Hand Guy is a character that can already get around Death Dealer Ray, because if you hold your S3, then he's not going to get too much value out of his Cloud of Death on his S3, right? He'll just go for S2 and S1. That's not the case. Based on the speed tuning, you might have these scenarios, you might have seen it with Angel of Light Angelica, where Hand Guy, Mediator Coeric, goes before the debuffer, and then he's at the bottom of the CR list, and then they run you over in the entire time it takes for him to get back to the top so that you can use Nature Restoration and actually allow you to fight the opponent. So based on the speed tuning, sometimes Hand Guy doesn't cut it, and a 30% CR push, especially in an Abyssal Euphine meta, that might not necessarily cut it. That's why on the S3, is it going to rain? There is a combat readiness component to it for Sharun, because she can lap back around way faster than Mediator Coeric actually can because of that innate 50% CR push. So you will push back their team by 20% and you will insert yourself up 50% CR, which means if they actually do try to go for it now, say if they outsped Sharun in the same example, well, she's going to come back around way faster than Hand Guy. And if you play her on like Warhorn, just like Mediator, then there's not really going to be an opportune window for you to ever actually go for it, the actual sleep, right? So, unlike Hand Guy here, this level 2 surface answer, is that Sharun is a counterpick to deter sleep and stun, period, because the character just has much better turn cycling than that character. Now, we move on to layer 3 of this iceberg. Is it going to rain as a defense break component? And like I talked about with that skill, Sharun has Maid Chloe's stat line. Maid Chloe at one point was the best hero in World Arena. And that's because you could play her at 260 speed in a very aggressive composition to give your whole team re-raise, so a second life, but more importantly, attack buff. So you could literally go Maid first, use attack buff, and establish dominance from there and run them over with things like Straze or whatever have you that came after the Maid Chloe. That's kind of like the birth of the aggro style. That's why Maid was so good, because it was good for turn 2, but also really good for setting up a lot of very, very aggressive drafts, right? On top of that, if your opponent actually does proc Cascade from Lullaby for the Waves, that works with AoE skills. Most people were probably thinking, oh, well, I get Cascade on my character, I do a bunch of single target attacks, I get 2,500 here, so I'm going to get a total of 10,000 fixed damage on my entire team from 4 Cascades. That's not necessarily the case. So if you use Is It Going to Rain as with Sharun as your like bridge or your opener, and they somehow have already given you the Cascade, you get like an absolute ton of value, because you get the pushback, then the Cascade, and you go into like maybe like Last Rider Crow S3, or any other AoE of your choice, maybe Abyssal S1, right? These things all are going to give you essentially 10,000 fixed damage, 4 instances of 2,500 fixed damage. That's pretty good, and it will give you a massive foothold in a lot of matches. So if you're going to be playing for the Cascade trigger, probably best to have some kind of AoE actually in the mix. So now Sharun is not necessarily just a counterpick character or a character to deter sleep entirely. Sharun is an aggro character that you can use to gain a massive foothold in a match. Now finally, the bottom layer of this iceberg, so to speak, is layer 4. So, Cleave as an archetype, it randomly loses to your opponent getting a CR push and cutting in front of you, getting a lucky AoE counterattack, or your opponent cutting in front of you with like Sage Ball and sleeping your team, or getting an Elberus Ritual Sword proc on like Green Armin and stunning your whole team, or a Politis S2 into Abyssal Crown, stunning your whole team. These are ways, traditionally, that turn 2 players have beaten Cleave. Well, what if you had a character that was somehow able to get rid of all the barriers on your opponent's team, push them back so that way you can have even more momentum, defense break their mitigation, and deny their chance of winning the game with their stuns or their sleeps? See where I'm getting at here? So Lullaby for the Waves means that Sharun is actually an anti-cleave unit who gives more firepower to cleave. So, did you catch that? This character is really good for standard because it stops you from getting screwed over by control. She's really good for aggro because you can play her mid-speed and completely undo all of your opponent's setup and get momentum. And she's good for cleave because if based on what your opponent drafts, a lot of the anti-cleave characters actually proc her passive, which allows you to get a ton of firepower, burst down their mitigation, and just completely run them over and win the game. In short, Dragon King Sharun is, I think, a must-pull. I think she's really good. One of the better Moonlights I've seen in a while. And I know we've had some pretty stacked ones. Like the obvious ones are the damage dealers like Abyssal, which I was pretty, on the fence about because I knew MLK was going to just hose that character pretty hard. But like even Landy just seemed really broken. But I think that people right now are just thinking of this character as a Death Deal Array answer and not seeing the big picture of what the character actually is capable of. She is very safe and boring in her kit, but it is incredibly effective, and I expect her to be used for a decent chunk of time. I mean, the character basically has a pseudo Bassar setup and denies some of the most debilitating debuffs that we have currently in the format. And even without all of that, even if you don't proc the S2 again, like, character still has strips, still has defense breaks, still has attack downs, still has stuns, still has CR pushes, right? The character still has inherent value, I feel like, even outside of the sleep or stun clause on her. And like I said, since she can be used in a huge variety of actual team compositions, and in, again, different ways too. Speed is most likely what people are going to be playing her on, but I already talked about the fact that there's probably a counterset Celestine or counterset Tree Branch build that can work with her. Yeah, I'm pretty high on this character, and I'm definitely pulling, and, we'll see if I'm right. I'm not always right here in my first thoughts and initial impressions, but this character seems like a definite good pickup, like a must pull, at least to me. Let me know down in the comments below, though, how you feel about Dragon King Sharun. Do you agree with my assessment that she is this, versatile, this multifaceted, right? Are you going to be pulling for her? Again, would love to know any and all comments. But yeah, that's going to do it for me here. These are my impressions on Dragon King Sharun. If you enjoyed the video, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all of those wonderful algorithm things. They do help me out here a ton. And as always, enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Bye-bye now.